appearance to shine through. I use these to build up the landscape around the wood. I also dip the moss in water to remove debris. The sphagnum moss is great as a background plant, while the star moss and thread moss were ideal for the midground. Lastly, I put liverwort and the stick covered in hypnomoss in the foreground. Accent stones, small patches of moss, twigs, sticks, and 2 acorn caps took it to the next level. Finally, I added some water and wiped off the inside of the container. Instead of sealing it with a lid, I tackled it from the angle of not having one. I placed the leftover plastic from earlier on top of the opening, along with glass to create an indent. Then I sealed it with a rubber band. I also covered it with burlap, which was an optional aesthetic move. At the end of it all, the result was a simple yet beautiful terrarium that I built for free. A lot of people were arguing with me at the time that these were things I bought at some point, so it's not truly free. Come on, literally all this stuff is commonly treated as waste, so you could just as easily ask to take it from someone's trash, or unfortunately find it as litter. I find containers and plastic bags in the woods all the time, and I've even turned them into terrariums myself. If anything, it's an interesting way to repurpose litter. Anyway, off of that tangent. Typically, when I make terrariums, I take very specific steps for the greatest probability of success. Anyone familiar with my process and methods probably noticed that I skipped a few steps. That brings us back to what I said at the beginning of the video, but I had to make sacrifices to fit within the free criteria. What exactly did I do differently? First of all, I used a piece of plastic for the barrier above the false bottom, which is not quite as permeable as materials I typically use, window screen or geotextile for example. I also didn't include a charcoal layer above this. Without saying too much, it helps purify the system. From what I've seen through experience, including it really does help, but how will a terrarium go without it? Another big change was the substrate. Typically, I mix up something like cocoa fiber, sand, orchid bark, and sphagnum moss. This works long term because it remains fluffy and aerated even when subjected to the wet, humid environments of a terrarium. I was able to replicate this to some extent by collecting soil full of sticks and twigs and by mending it with bark chunks, but again, will it hold up? Additionally, I always add springtails to address mold and to encourage a natural nutrient decomposition cycle. Luckily, the soil from outside was already teeming with life, including springtails, so in some ways there are advantages to using this over the mix I described earlier. However, I sealed the system with a plastic bag and a rubber band. Sure, I included the indent to encourage condensation to drip from the middle of the lid, but this is all pointless if it can't even retain water for an extended period of time. Lastly, what about the moss itself? I always use it, but something I don't typically talk about is that not all temperate species will last in a terrarium long term. I tried to pick ones that I've had success with in the past, but you never truly know until you try it out. That finally brings us to the 3-month mark. You can tell immediately how much has changed and how well everything was doing. The sphagnum moss grew straight to the top of the jar, and a piece can even be seen in the front. The other mosses and liverwort wove into quite the carpet here as well. I personally thought it looked beautiful. Moving down into the false bottom, you can see that it's full of moss. I always think it's cool when this happens. At this point, it appeared that the plastic barrier in the false bottom was functioning as intended based on how well the terrarium appeared to be doing. Another highlight are the acorn caps. They were infiltrated by moss, which was cool to see because even this early on, the terrarium was taking on a life of its own. The springtails also seemed to be alive and well, doing what they do. Considering the progress of it all, I concluded that the other components, like the lid and substrate, were holding up well. Even so, it was probably still a little too early to say for sure if this was truly a viable long-term solution, despite believing that to be the case at the time. 6 months after that, and things were still looking good. Not too far off from the previous checkup, but definitely more grown in. It was at this point that I decided it was finally time to open it up for maintenance. At first glance, I could tell that things appeared a little dry on the inside. That was no doubt the result of the rubber band. It was all dry rotten and snapped when I removed the plastic. Luckily, I caught it early on because this was the first sign of cracks in the foundation. No checkup is complete without a proper sniff. It smelled just like the forest, so I was still confident that everything was doing well. And the first thing that greeted me from the inside was the sphagnum moss. It was continuing on its pursuit to the top of the container and looked awesome. I also noticed that the driftwood was covered in neat little fungi. Despite enjoying the sphagnum moss, it needed a trim. However, I only removed a minimal amount to retain the background effect it was producing. I pulled out that rogue piece in the front as well, along with dead sections in the back that I replaced with trimmings from the top. The foreground also needed a haircut. I went through and trimmed it down to reveal more of the hardscape. However, this created a total mess that I had to meticulously remove with tweezers to maintain the aesthetic.